Episode 4 of Life on Earth is called The Swarming Hordes, and this episode continues to deal with plants and insects, more of the latter as the episode goes on. The episode opens up with a montage of various insects, but what's great about this is it starts out really quiet, but as the sequence goes on and more insects appear, the sounds of the insects increase to the point where it's really loud, which really emphasises the point of there being that many insects in the world. And the first bit of footage we get features Attenborough talking about a swarm of locusts. So as this episode is called The Swarming Hordes, we pretty much open up with the biggest swarms on Earth, and those are locusts. And he does a good job of using locusts as an example of the typical insect body. Despite different insects being very different from each other, they all have the same body plan, and locusts are a good example to use to highlight that. And then we move on to talk about plants. So the first bit of this episode is very plant heavy, I would say. There isn't a huge amount of specific insects discussed. And I'd say this first half does drag a little bit more for me. I think it just felt a little bit much compared to the last episode, which obviously was very plant heavy as well, and I am someone who's more interested in animals. But it does a good job of talking about pollination, and pollination is interesting. They highlight how flowers are pretty much evolved to attract insects. We may find them attractive, but we're not really the main targets of them. It is very much insects, and they do a good job of showing you what insects see when they show you the ultraviolet light. Even more plain flowers are pretty attractive. The mechanisms to attract insects are pretty good. It's not just physical, they also use scent. There's various different types of insects that are attracted to scent, particularly things like flies, which are attracted to flowers that, smell a bit more like rotting flesh. They highlight the same kind of thing we've seen a lot since, of flies getting trapped by the plant overnight, cultivate pollen, and then leave the next day to pollinate other flowers. It's something that I have seen quite a lot since, so maybe wasn't as engaged with that particular sequence in this episode. However, this was one of the first times they'd ever shown that, so, they can't really knock them for that. It's really in the plant's best interest to really only attract one specific type of insect, and you see the variations in different flowers to attract specific insects, whether that be flowers designed to attract a specific shape of insect, like the ones that specifically target bees. The yucca plant is the one that is highlighted as being the most specific to a specific insect, a type of moth. So that whole stuff is interesting, but I think it did go on a bit. I think when it moves into the more insect-heavy part of the episode, it does get more interesting for me. They do a good job of springboarding from the flowers into the insects, though, because they highlight how pollinating insects are so drawn to specific flowers. Other insects that are a bit more predatory actually use that to their advantage. Mantises are probably the most famous ones. There are a lot of mantises that actually look like flowers, and they're pretty well camouflaged. Like, you really wouldn't notice it's not a flower. And that allows us to talk about other insects, specifically molting. There's a lot of insects that shed their outer casing to become larger versions of themselves. However, there's a lot of other insects that actually metamorphosize, and they use the most famous examples of that to highlight that, and that is the caterpillars. So caterpillars are highlighted as being pretty much just eating machines. They look so different as well from butterflies that they'll eventually turn into. They've got 4 pairs of legs, which is really weird. And because caterpillars are designed to just eat, they've got to be continuously expanding, so they can't afford to have harder outer casings. So they've got all these wacky defense mechanisms, things like really long irritating hairs, having specific markings to freak predators out, being really brightly coloured to advertise that they don't taste very well or that they might be poisonous. And then we explore the actual process of metamorphosis, how the caterpillars construct their chrysalis, which is actually then shading their skin and the lower layer actually solidifying, and the rest of the caterpillar essentially becoming liquefied, and the cells will then recombine to become a butterfly. And they go into just as much detail with butterflies. Butterflies are probably the most attractive insects. They're the ones that we all kind of like, and they do a good job of using butterflies as an example of what a model insect is like. Post-metamorphosis, butterflies don't really have conventional mouth parts. Their only job is really breeding. So it does a good job of showing you the compartmentalization of the lives of the different insects at different stages of their lives. And we use moths as an example of showing you how big insects can get. Insects are pretty much restricted due to their respiratory system. They can't get that big because the longer an insect is, the less efficient its diffusion is. Despite insects being restricted by size, we highlight how some insects are able to overcome that through becoming superorganisms. The first example of that we get are termites. Termites are, pretty famous. They build these massive mound structures, which is highlighted as being a really impressive feat for an insect. And the termite stuff is really good. It does highlight how eusociality works. We do talk about eusociality and how it's a really weird thing to evolve because things are done for the majority, not the individual. They highlight that because no one individual of one of these colonies would survive on their own. So essentially, collectively, they are one big superorganism. And we talk about the other animals that do that, things like wasps. Talk about parasitic wasps as well. That is highlighted. That's a pretty important thing. We don't talk about that a lot, but they do highlight that. Bees as well. Bees are actually portrayed as being more solitary, and I guess of all the Hymenoptera, they are one of the more solitary ones, but they talk about the gradual sociality among bees, how some of them are forced to colonially nest together. That eventually leads to things like honeybees. They do a good job of highlighting the waggle dance, which is how honeybees are able to lead each other to food. It's a pretty good mechanism. I think I've heard that before, I've heard it explored before, but I don't think there's too many series that have actually showed it on screen, I don't think. And the rest of the episode talks about ants. So ants are probably for me, the most interesting type of insects, and they're the most extreme examples of eusociality. And we show how ants are pretty much compartmentalized into different groups, workers, soldiers, that kind of thing, and how they all serve specific functions. Leafcutter ants are explored pretty well. Leafcutter ants are explored quite a lot in these series, and I think this was the first time they were shown on screen. That may be wrong, but I think it is. They're using these specific paths to gather all these leaves, bring back and farm fungi, which they can actually eat. And the final sequence we get and features army ants. Army ants are probably among the most famous ants. You see how the ants actually form their own nests through their bodies to protect the queen. And every few weeks they'll move on to another area, they'll move on to a tree, they're able to set up a bit more of a permanent structure. The queen's able to lay their eggs and then they move on. And we see how they're basically just these killing machines. They go out, they wipe out everything in their path, whether that be other insects or larger animals, sometimes even cattle, because army ants are by far the most intimidating insects we can think of. And as this episode is called The Swarming Hordes, that's pretty much the ultimate way of showcasing that, I think. So that's really good. And we end the episode with Attenborough saying how humans and insects have clashed for as long as humans have been alive, pretty much, and that despite our best efforts, we've not been able to eradicate a single species. I think today that's probably different. I think humans are actually doing a lot of damage to insects, but back in the 70s, you know, we didn't really know that much about that. So yeah, this episode is pretty good. It is my least favourite episode of the series so far. I think that's just because the first half dragged a bit with the flowers. It was a bit repetitive. The stuff with insects was really good though, I like that. I don't think the episode really highlighted the sheer diversity of insects. They really just talked about butterflies and caterpillars and the superorganisms, but I guess those are the most interesting aspects of insect life. And we did talk about insects in the last episode as well, I guess, so you know, that is fair. So yeah, I'll forgive them for that. But yeah, as it stands, it is my least favourite one, though it is still pretty good. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought of this episode, what you think of this video. Let me know, and I'll be doing the next one next week, which goes back to the oceans and talks about fish, so look forward to that. And yeah, as ever, feel free to like, comment and subscribe, or don't if you don't want to, it's perfectly fine. And I'll see you next time, and goodbye.